Hi, I'm Paul Austin, and I'm about to have a productive conversation with Mike Vardy.
Welcome to A Productive Conversation. I'm Mike Vardy, and this is a very interesting and perhaps, I would say controversial, but definitely a different kind of episode. I speak with Paul F. Austin. He is a prominent figure in psychedelics and has guided millions to safe and meaningful psychedelic experiences through his work as the founder of Third Wave. Featured in Forbes, Rolling Stone, and the BBC's Work Life, he pioneers the convergence of psychedelics, personal transformation, and professional success. I really wanted to have this conversation. You'll hear why during the beginning of our conversation. But Paul is a fascinating guy. He empowers leaders, creatives, and pioneers to leverage psychedelics for profound personal and professional growth. He views psychedelics as refined skills cultivated through mentorship, exploration, and purposeful use. That's key, critical for humanity's ongoing evolution. And as the longest standing and youngest entrepreneur in this field, Paul's focus on merging psychedelics with professional development is evident in his transformative training program, Psychedelic Coaching Institute. The program caters to individuals who seek to integrate their psychedelic experiences into their business practices, all under the guidance of one of the industry's most trusted leaders. You're getting a great conversation where we talk about mastering microdosing, so much more. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Paul F. Austin. Paul, thanks so much for taking the time to join me here today. Really appreciate it, having you here on a productive conversation.
Yeah, I can't wait to get into it, Mike. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
So first things first is I want to get into the idea of microdosing because this I shared with you literally before we hopped on the recording that when I discovered the work that you were doing and the book we're going to refer to is Mastering Microdosing, How to Use Subperceptual Psychedelics to Heal Trauma, Improve Performance, and Transform Your Life. And immediately, the reason that I wanted to talk to you is I was walking through my neighborhood and somebody, and I told you this before we hit, so this is not a surprise to you, on a telephone pole, like one of those hydro poles, again, being from Canada, we'll call them a hydro pole, is like a 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper with, like, where they put like the phone numbers and the email addresses and they have them all, where you could take one and it said like, explore microdosing, explore this. And I'm like, it's something I've always been fascinated by, especially when you listen to the work of Michael Pollan, and there have been other books I've come across where they've talked about this. What I want to get into is those people who are listening that
Mhm.
immediately almost feel a visceral response to where they hear the term microdosing. When they hear about like putting something in you that, has long been taboo or perhaps even illegal, depending on where you were. What do you say to those people who immediately want to dismiss our conversation before we even get into it?
Well, usually the context that I provide is we as humans, we love to alter our consciousness, right? We love drugs. And the drugs that have been acceptable in the last 400 to 500 years are caffeine from coffee, largely, but also tea, alcohol, and nicotine and tobacco. And so we have a very sort of and this comes from industrialism and there's many other things, but the important part is we love to take drugs. Almost all of us take drugs on a daily basis because we all love our coffee or we love our tea or we love our caffeine. Most of us drink alcohol, right? We don't really smoke much tobacco or nicotine, but there's more and more people taking nicotine mints and vapes and zins and things like that. And so
Yep.
usually my perspective on that is from the science and the research that we have. We know that psychedelics, particularly psilocybin mushrooms and LSD, which are the two most common forms of psychedelics that folks microdose, that they are safer than tobacco, alcohol, and certainly less addictive than caffeine, better tolerated than caffeine. And so if you look at the objective data of those two psychedelics compared to the legal drugs that we have available, for me, it's a little bit insane that they are still prohibited and illegal because it's very clear that they are safe, that they are non addictive, and most importantly, that they can help people not only with trauma, with depression and anxiety and PTSD, but also just to be more in flow, to be more creative, to be more productive, which is why psychedelics have been used since the 1950s in Silicon Valley, which is a whole nother thing.
Well, and when I talked to Stephen Kotler about this, because we were talking about I mean, I've had several conversations with him. We'll link to one of the more episodes where we talk about peak performance and flow in the show notes here. That was one of the things that kept coming up for me, was this idea of getting into flow state, and not just getting there, but actually being immersive within it. Like sometimes, I mean, most people, when they're in a flow state, they get there and it can be elusive, right? Especially in a world that we live in, which is so demanding of our time, attention, energy. It's about, the quantity of what you get done as opposed to the quality, or at least there's an imbalance there. When someone is looking at this elusive state of flow, or they feel like they're not getting into it enough, and they're trying things like, and there's other ways to approach this. I mean, we're hearing more about the idea of slow productivity from Cal Newport, like
Mhm.
slowing things down. But because of how the pathways have been connected. I mean, even my daughter the other day said, I don't really like to watch movies. They just take too long and there's too much attention. I'm like, holy smokes, but there's some amazing, like, I want to go see Interstellar with her when it comes back to theaters this year. And it's like in the IMAX. And I'm like, you know, you this is going to be a 3-hour film that we're going to have to pay attention to. So how do you want to heighten that? Do you want to heighten that experience, or do you even want to be able to have that experience? So can we get into the idea of flow and where microdosing, and for those, maybe give a little bit of a Cliff's Notes version of what microdosing is, because I think people
For sure.
do have that, like, well, what is microdosing? And then how can it help me find or even stay in that elusive flow state?
So microdosing is the idea of taking a sub-perceptual dose of a psychedelic. It's about a tenth of a regular dose. So a regular dose for mushrooms might be 2 to 3 grams, or LSD might be 100 to 200 micrograms. And so a microdose for LSD is anywhere from 10 to 15 to 20 micrograms, and for psilocybin mushrooms, it's anywhere from 100 to 150 to 200 milligrams. And the intention behind microdosing is that you're doing it 2 or 3 times a week for a period of at least 30 days. Some folks do it for 60 days or 90 days. And so when we're looking at that overlap between microdosing and flow, a lot of the structural elements that are required for flow, like have no distractions, set aside a 2 hour time block, take on a task that is, I think Kotler talks about it as 4% more challenging than what you're used to. It's got
Right.
to push a little bit, right? What we've noticed with microdosing is that structure and container still has to be set up. And when folks microdose, it just gets them to drop in that much better, and it allows for an enhanced state of focus that would otherwise be inaccessible. And so what we notice when folks are working with microdosing and they've set up the container appropriately, then instead of it going for maybe 2 hours, it might go to 2.5 or 3 hours. So there might be some elongation of that flow state. They notice that there's a capacity to see the relationships between, especially if like we're writing or working on a creative project, all of a sudden new ideas start to come online and form much easier. It's almost like there's a lubricant
Hmm.
for the and that microdosing helps the overall process just to feel a little bit smoother. So I would say A, it helps with the dropping in, just the initial, how do I get focused and stay focused? And B, it can help to elongate that overall period of flow. So instead of just being 2 hours, some folks will notice 2.5, 3 hours. They can stay very focused and immersed in the work that they're doing.
You mentioned earlier, you touched on the idea of in the valley, it being prominent in the valley, right? And technology firms are down there, and people, as we're recording this, Apple just released their new, or at least started talking about what they're going to be introducing into their Mac OS and iOS. Artificial intelligence is going to play a role. We're going to circle back to AI, because I think that there's some elements there that may be interesting to kind of explore with relationship to microdosing. But the connection between psychedelics and technology, you mentioned, like, many of the people who became giants in the tech field used LSD in their formative years and developed breakthrough computer technologies. Steve Jobs immediately comes to mind in my head when I think about that. But from the start, a small but significant crossover existed between those who were experimenting with drugs and the burgeoning tech community in San Francisco. So for the very people who could be listening to the show that, like, Mike loves his tech and his apps and stuff like that, like, there's no real escape isn't the right word, but I think a lot of people don't understand or see the correlation between the technology that we're using that's being developed in the valley and where microdosing kind of fit in. So can we dive into that a little bit?
For sure. So in the 1950s, LSD came back on the scene. And I mention that because even the name Third Wave, which is the educational platform that I built out, suggests there was a first wave and a second wave, right? The first wave being ancient and indigenous use. So you had individuals like Plato and Aristotle and Marcus Aurelius drinking a beverage called kukion, which is made from ergot, a fungus that grows on rye, which is the same thing that LSD is made from. So essentially, the ancient philosophers that were really incredibly influential in terms of our modern worldview and Western civilization often had these profound, let's say, high dose experiences with a cousin of LSD. And then when LSD was reinvented in 1938 by a Swiss chemist, it was legal, it was freely available. And in the 1950s, Stanford started doing research on LSD. And one individual in particular, Ken Kesey, who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, was involved in those early clinical trials. And so when Ken had those experiences, he came out of those clinical experiments and started doing these things called the acid tests. And at that time, it was him, the Grateful Dead, and an individual named Stuart Brand. And Stuart Brand is well known because he was quoted in Steve Jobs' commencement speech in 2005 that Jobs gave at Stanford. And essentially, Steve Jobs said he was heavily influenced by this thing called the Whole Earth Catalog. And Stuart Brand invented the Whole Earth Catalog. He was an early pioneer in LSD. And in 1972, he wrote an article in Rolling Stone where he called the personal computer as the next form of LSD. And so you had a lot of these individuals who were sort of plugged in, because when you have a very high dose experience with psychedelics or LSD, you sort of feel like you're plugged into this grid.
Mm,
There's this interconnectedness that you feel. And so naturally, when folks come out of that, they go, well, what technologies can we invent and create that actually help us to better communicate with folks on an everyday basis? And so the computer came about, and then eventually phones came about. And now it's like we take it for granted, but at any point in time, you can talk or communicate to anyone in the world, right? And so
mhm.
that sense of the what I'll call it mycelial network, the communication form that came about in the 1960s and 70s was heavily influenced by LSD. So you had Stuart Brand, Steve Jobs is really well known. Bill Gates talks about his experiences with LSD, how impactful they were. You also had a gentleman named Douglas Engelbart, and Douglas was the inventor of the computer mouse and the computer interface. And he talked about how LSD was very influential in helping him to initially come up with that sort of idea and perspective. And so a lot of it to me comes down to when you have this experience with a high dose of LSD, you feel deeply connected. When you come out of that state, you go, how do we actually replicate that in our everyday life? And
Mm.
so from my understanding, that's why the computer and the internet and, personal phones and all came about, was heavily influenced by those early experiences with psychedelics. And there's two really good books on that if folks wanted to go deeper into it. One is called What the Dormouse Said by John Markoff, and the other one is called From Counterculture to Cyberculture by Fred Turner, who's a professor at Stanford. And if folks are interested in that overlap, I would highly encourage them to do a deeper dive into that relationship.
We'll link to those books in the show notes as well, of course, to your book. It's when I think about AI now, and I mean, I couldn't help but go into that. We're seeing more and more people like AI is the genie's out of the bottle. Everyone who's like, I mean, it's happening, right? So, uh, there could be some resistance to it, and there will be, but it's going to become part of. It already is part. It's just
For
more mainstream now. And once you see it, kind of hop on an iPhone and become like fully integrated both on the device and also in the cloud, then you know that it's part and parcel. So I all I've thought about relating to microdosing around that is, and this is not just relating to microdosing, but just in general, is if AI can do the things that AI can do well, and we set it, I wouldn't say and forget it, but we set it up and then we fine tune it over time, which then frees us to do more exploration, to do the nuanced, creative slash innovative work that only humans can really do at this juncture. What role do you think microdosing will have with this now emergent technology really staring at us, not just in the face, but just like daily becoming part of the world that we live in.
So I'm glad you brought this up because this comes back into what I was talking about with the drugs that are accepted and the drugs that are not necessarily accepted, right? The drugs that became very prominent in industrialism were caffeine, nicotine, and alcohol. Caffeine and nicotine help with a process called convergent thinking, which is you know what you need to get done, just go do it, right?
Hmm.
Classic productivity.
Yeah.
Hit the list, execute, make sure you get those things done. Alcohol then, of course, helps you to unwind and relax at night. So you can sort of hit the reset button and go at it the next day. Anything that supports divergent thinking, specifically a drug like LSD or psilocybin mushrooms, has sort of been put to the wayside, right? Because the creative geniuses is prior to what I would call the information era,
Right.
which started to take about in the 60s, were often stigmatized and sort of, left out. We don't really need creative genius. We just need to know how to get things done and make sure those things get done. So with the rise of LSD in Silicon Valley, with the rise of tech, with the rise of remote work, with the rise of this capacity to fully leverage creativity to have exponential outcomes, all of a sudden the skill of creativity is that much more valuable. And I think it was Peter Thiel who recently said that with the rise of AI, it's not that those who are mathematicians and those who are doing tasks that can just be done by artificial intelligence, by computation, by quantitative measurements, they'll be out of a job. The ones who are actually going to be supported by artificial intelligence and amplified are the creatives, are folks who are able to go, okay, there's this clear problem and the solution is uncertain. And the capacity to actually think divergently, which I would classify as you're taking two ideas that are seemingly unrelated and looking at how they synthesize and come together to form a solution to a problem that was previously not been able to have been solved. That is really critical and essential. And so in my belief, it's like with the rise of artificial intelligence, those who are have the capacity to be creative, to come up with novel ideas, those who have the capacity then to communicate those ideas to others around them, those are going to be the ones who are most highly sought after, I would say. And I would say psychedelics fit perfectly into that lens and that orientation because they really can help to develop the skill of thinking outside the box, of thinking creatively. Now, the caveat is there still has to be rooting and grounding in what's actually can be executed against or what's actually feasible. And I think
Right.
that's the thing a lot of folks say. It's like, these are folks just getting high. Who's to say that their ideas are actually any good? And so there certainly needs to be a process where those ideas then are tested and vetted. But IDEO, which is a Silicon Valley design firm, is a really good example of this. A lot of folks who are inside of IDEO have known to be using psychedelics as part of their design thinking. In fact, there's a new nonprofit called Center for Minds that's run by a gentleman named Bruce Dahmer that's specifically looking at this overlap of psychedelics and creativity because most of the research that's been done on psychedelics has been on mental health, depression, PTSD, and addiction.
Yeah.
And I think the greatest potential for psychedelics actually lies in their capacity to help us to think drastically different, especially in the face of all of the sort of meta crises that we are currently faced with.
It's funny because you're right. A lot of the quote drugs. I mean, I keep thinking about ADHD and Ritalin and things like that, and that to me, to go back to the idea of convergent, right? Like the convergent process. That's what that helps with, right? Like it's like okay, but what there are some, and I know if you're listening to this and you have ADHD, I'm gonna couch my response by saying I'm not a doctor. Obviously, I don't know it. I'm not ADHD or I'm not diagnosed in that way. But to me, it almost feels like that can also, while it unlocks the ability to do convergent stuff, it can lock up some of the stuff that maybe a gift that someone with ADHD has
Right.
the ability to unlock naturally. Now, when the reason, I mean, and you can't see, people can't see this, but I started to smile when you were getting to the point about the idea of what drugs have done, like in terms of healing trauma, and that's important, but it almost lends itself to the idea of we get medicine or we get seek treatment when we're broken, not to maintain or sustain. And that's a Western thing. Whereas in Eastern, my wife, who's an acupuncturist who has experience with Chinese medicine, a lot of that is about, if someone goes and gets acupuncture, it's not going to be like, okay, so I'm done now, right? Like that's it. Like, no, no, no. You have to, it's a practice. It's habitual. It's holistic. It's not something that is a one and done. You alluded to that off the top where it's like a 30-day process or a 60-day. It's not like you're going to microdose once and everything's going to unlock. What I think that's got to be part of it is this Western thought of traditional or maybe prevalent Western thought that medicine and drugs are for fixing a problem, not worth necessarily taking regularly to create like
Enhance
emergent thinking. I think that I love. Can we dance on that a little bit? Like I'd love to hear your thoughts
the
on that.
emergent thinking. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, the way that I look at it is like we're in the West, we're so conditioned to think of ourselves as machines. And I think most productivity advice also falls into this, right? We take a
Quant-
very reductive.
Quantitative over qualitative, for sure, for
Right, we take
sure.
a very reductive approach to this, and so even the language that we use, it's like we got to fix what's broken, right?
Hmm.
And part of that is rooted in Christianity and sort of Protestants and sin and all that, but also part of it is rooted in industrialism in the sense of we are machines and we have to make ourselves better and better and better, right?
Yeah,
Self optimization, all that, and there's a space for that for sure. But what we learn from the Eastern perspective and Eastern worldview is a lot of this is how do we just bring ourselves back to homeostasis, back to balance, and back to center. So I also love Taoism and what they teach through Taoism is that there is this middle way,
hmm,
right? And so I really look at microdosing as a beautiful middle way between the Western fixation on productivity and the Eastern understanding of what it means to like be whole and centered and present. And that for me, the thing that microdosing is doing oftentimes is it's allowing us to maintain a sense of playfulness while still executing against the things that are most important to us. And that's why we even mentioned flow, right? In flow states is so much of what's into part of flow is taking on something that's super fun,
yeah,
right? And so even looking at how we redefine productivity, where it's not necessarily these days about how do we work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, unless you're like an early stage startup founder and you just need to get something off the ground. More and more, it's about how are you leveraging the resources that are available to you and how can you move things exponentially, potentially with the help of a substance like LSD or psilocybin to facilitate that process, to catalyze more neuroplasticity, to catalyze more creativity. So, really looking at psychedelics, I would say, as an ally, because I think the other thing that we have in our worldview is we look at plants and specifically plants as inert. We look at them as non intelligent. We look at them as sort of these dead things.
yeah.
And what the East has often taught us is plants have intelligence, right? And I think that's especially true with psychedelic plants. There's a deep intelligence in those plants, and learning how to work with that intelligence, I think, will be beneficial for a lot of creatives, founders, entrepreneurs, or those who are just generally interested in execution, because that capacity to go from good to great,
Hmm.
right? The capacity for self-actualization, that was the initial intention behind a lot of the psychedelic exploration in the 50s and 60s. It wasn't necessarily to heal depression and PTSD and addiction, right? The Esalen Institute, which is this incredible retreat center in Big Sur, came about because of the desire to really explore what is possible in the human experience. And I think that's what psychedelics can really help to facilitate more than anything. Because once we dream a new dream or imagine new possibilities, then we can really inspire and motivate teams to get behind us to take on a mission that we think will have an impact on the world at large.
And again, when people think about things like LSD in particular, first thing that comes to mind for a lot of people is the Beatles. Like the story of when the Beatles went from like being these clean cut kids to like they went and experimented and all of a sudden, but no one really talks about. It's funny because people go, "Oh, look at the way they look now. Look at the way that they're." And first off, a lot of that would have to do with images, like just the way they feel anyway. But I mean, no one's sitting there going, well, I mean, that era of music that they did earlier versus the era of music that they did later. I don't, it's hard to compare them because they're so different, but I would argue that they're equally good in their own way and it unlocked stuff for them. But they're not sitting there. And I think this is where people get conflated because they think about things like, again, 5 cups of coffee a day, a beer when they get home from work, or a couple of glasses of wine, or I mean, you could even throw sugar into this mix if you wanted to, like but we're not talking about getting blasted. I think that's the thing is again, nuance, right? Maybe this is another Western thing is it's either all or nothing, right? Like it's not again, the middle way we talk about when it comes to fitness, what's the idea of the Japanese and are like move a lot, lift heavy things and do that regularly. And here we have high intensity 7-minute workouts that are designed to like get it in and get it out, as opposed to what if it was just a way of life, a way of being? And I know that when we talked about productivity, you mentioned, I talk about this. I wrote an essay about this called The Path to Productiveness. I don't like the term productivity anymore because it has been corrupt. Like it's this idea of activity for activity's sake. And that was brought up thanks to the industrial revolution, the information era, like all of that stuff coming up, where it wasn't about like a state of producing, a state of being productive, which took into account the quality of what you were producing, not just the quantity. But now
Right.
productivity is it ness was replaced by like activity, like this, not a state, but like the activity of it, right? So productiveness was the word and it went out of fashion. And now productivity is the power or ability to produce, comma, especially in abundance, right? So we assume abundance is numerical, right? We do. I mean, we tend to look at life and going, well, they lived a really long life. Well, yeah, but what if they did a lot of not really amazing things during that life? Like, would they consider it? I know people who lived to their, late 40s who lived fuller lives than people who lived to their 90s. So we have to reframe the conversation around a lot of these things. And I think when it comes to microdosing, I mean, it's becoming, when you've got a guy like Michael Pollan who talks about it, that people were, wait a minute, it's kind of like Ryan Holiday writing about growth hacking and then talking about stoicism. Michael Pollan was talking about the food we eat, the omnivores develop. Hey, by the way, you should try this thing. And they're like, wait, what?
Right.
Why not? I mean, if it worked for Ryan Holiday to get people into stoicism, why can't it work the other way? Like where is what do you think needs to happen to break that barrier so that we can get to a place where, and we're seeing it in some cultures where, hey, you can go, like where I live in British Columbia, not only can I go to buy marijuana or any of that stuff where I want, like related to cannabis, I can go to a government store to buy it now because they have a government cannabis store, just like they have a government liquor store, and the government's making money off the taxes of it and all that stuff. And interestingly, I could buy it here, have it here, travel into Washington State, not bringing it with me, obviously. Not that I'm doing that, but anyway. And then it's fine there. But if you go a state over, and it's like, have you ever smoked weed? Yes. Oh, well, you're barred. You could be barred from entering the U.S. because it's governed. Like, so every state has its own rule. So we're seeing more acceptance around this stuff. What do we need? What do you think we need to do as a society to kind of unlock it? To like, this is obviously a start, but what are some of the other things you see either that can happen or maybe that are unfolding that will maybe break this taboo, so to speak?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So 61% of Americans now support legal psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. This was a research study that was done by Cal Berkeley last year. So we now have a majority of Americans that are supportive of legal psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. You also had the number of Americans that took a psychedelic quadrupled from 2019 to 2023. So 4x the number of people took psychedelics in 2023 as 2019, largely because of microdosing, but also in the United States, what's become more prevalent is at-home ketamine. And that's a whole another
Yeah.
thing that I won't go into, but it can be helpful for a lot of folks who don't want to continue to be on SSRIs and, conventional psychiatric medication. So we're already seeing quite a shift. I think the challenge is when it's like in cannabis, in cannabis in the United States, there are several states, a ton of states that have now legalized cannabis, but according to the federal government, it's still a Schedule 1 substance, meaning there's no medical value and it's highly addictive and highly dangerous. Psychedelics are in a similar place where Colorado has now legalized a lot of these plant medicines. Oregon has legalized psilocybin mushrooms, but according to the federal government, these are still highly addictive and they have no medical value. That will change in the next year or two. So the FDA is on the verge of approving MDMA, also known as ecstasy, to treat PTSD. There's been over $2 billion that's now been invested into biotech companies specifically to get psychedelic medicine approved through the clinical pathway. A little bit different than cannabis because cannabis just went for the recreational market right away. It's a little bit different with psychedelics. I think it's still going to be probably another decade before we see a recreational market with psychedelics, if even then. So a lot of the emphasis has been on the clinical use, has been on clinical trials, on more and more research. And my expectation is that by the end of this decade, so in about 5 years, the majority of folks in Canada, the United States, and even in Europe will have legal access to psychedelic substances. That could be through the FDA clinical path, that could be in the state of California or the province of British Columbia. It will likely be through the federal government in Canada. I think
Yeah.
they're on the verge of approving psilocybin and MDMA as well. Um, but I would say we're farther along than we ever have been. When I started Third Wave in 2015, 9 years ago, people thought I was insane for what I was doing, for openly talking about microdosing and psychedelics. And so the massive shift that we've seen in just 9 years is pretty incredible, in large part thanks to Michael Pollan's book, but also because of all the clinical research that's been carried out, because of Joe Rogan and Tim Ferriss and Sam Harris and Peter Attia and all these major podcasters who are also talking about it. And so now when I look at the overall landscape, my assessment is, okay, it's clear that like we're leaps and bounds ahead of where we used to be. A lot of the stigma has fallen away. Now we have to go, okay, how do we ensure people when they do this safely, responsibly, and intentionally? And that's why I love microdosing, because microdosing is a very low risk way to start to work with psychedelics. You don't need to, you know, kill your ego. You don't need to spend 8 hours tripping in a room. You can just take a little bit on a daily basis to see how it helps with your mood, your energy, your sleep, your sex life, your work projects, whatever it is. And folks, as they start to engage in that way, it kind of goes back to Robert Cialdini, who wrote that book, Persuasion. He's like, if you want someone to take a big step, get them to take a very small step first. And I think for a lot of folks, microdosing is that very small step. It helps them to realize, oh, this is actually beneficial. It feels good. It's helping me. This isn't something to be scared of. And that allows a lot of the stigmatization to sort of fall away as folks come to realize, oh, there's actual tangible real world benefits of working with these low doses of psychedelics.
Before we wrap up, I want to follow up with a question with relation to fear and ego. You brought up ego.
Yeah.
Obviously, Stoics, that's an area that, I mean, Ryan Holiday wrote a whole book. He's written a whole series, but one book called Ego is the Enemy. And one of the things he talked about is like ego dissolution and the idea of overcoming fear. I'm a huge Green Lantern fan. Anyone who's followed me for a while knows that. So will is the opposite of fear, or is the enemy of fear in that kind of universe. And I wonder, again, when it comes to microdosing, it's these things that we are small, like you said, take small steps, but it's these things that are lying beneath the surface, right? Like this fear of, could be imposter syndrome, could be the comparison trap, could be like, this is not who I am. This is not what I'm, again, you mentioned some of the people that are talking more about this. And they're like, yeah, but that's them. Oh, I can't do that because who am I to, what will my family think? All that kind of stuff. So
Right.
when it comes to those areas of specifically fear, because I think they're all rooted there. What are some of the things? Give me an example of something that unlocked for you that kind of has allowed you to kind of, I wouldn't say cast fear aside because you can't, but at least to dance with it better.
Yeah, I mean, so what happens when we take a psychedelic, even a low dose of the psychedelic, is that it downregulates the fear response in the amygdala. So there's literally a neurobiological impact of psychedelics on the fear response in the brain, right? And so when I started psychedelics, I started taking them myself many, many years ago, 15 years ago when I was 19. I'm almost 34 now. And in 2015, when I started openly talking about it, what I came to realize is the fear of getting arrested, the fear of what my parents thought of me, the fear of what my friends thought of me, all of that fell away because I had had my life such profoundly impacted by these substances. And I knew that if I could communicate their benefits in a way that was rooted in science, in a way that was rooted in objectivity, in a way that was rooted in real world and tangible benefits, that it could also help other people overcome the fear of actually working with these substances. And so for me, the relationship is very direct and clear, that because I had a powerful experience and relationship with these substances, I was able to take on a project and a task and a mission that a lot of people thought was insane. A lot of people thought I was insane. A lot of people were like, you're going to get yourself arrested or, thrown in prison or whatever it is. And yet here I am 9 years later. and I've had not a single issue whatsoever. And that's partly because I know the line to toe. I
Yeah.
don't cross that line, but I think it's also because, um, frankly speaking, there's much bigger fish to fry at
Yeah.
this point in time when it comes to drugs.
You're
And
not that important. Like that's the ego.
no,
I know it's crazy. It sounds, and see, that's an interesting thing is that when I say that to you, not in a way of like, to make you feel like, well, okay, I think I am kind of important, but it's that idea of, but that's the thing, right? We're like, oh my God, like everyone, what's that? Hugh McLeod has a great photo. I think I'll put in the show notes, but it's like what we think's happening and everyone's looking at us and he goes, what's actually happening? And everyone's looking at their phones. Right.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
we're not that important, like even,
I mean,
and conversely, when you hear about like the Joe Rogans, the Tim Ferrisses, the Ryan Holidays, all the people, they're still doing like, it's again, they still put their pants on one leg at a time. They still face the same issues so it kind of, I think that what I would love to hear your thoughts on this as we wrap up, because
mhm.
I want to be respectful, but I think that it's the sustained element of just keeping a practice of microdosing in a way that way when you're not necessarily quote in under the quote the influence as some people might think, those patterns stay. They like, speaking of emergent, once they're there, once you put them in front of you, I believe,
Mhm.
like, again, I'm not that important. Oh, I'm not that doesn't go away. Like when you're, unlike in some instances where if you say you've drank quite a bit and those inhibitions disappear and the next day you wake up and like, what did
Right.
I do again? What did I say? Like those things don't tend to disappear when you are, when you unlock something like that. Right.
And I'm glad you brought that up because often what we say is microdosing is not a magic pill, right? Part of the power of microdosing is getting out of this perspective of I have to take something outside of myself to feel better or work better or do better or whatever it is. That microdosing is a catalyst, it's an opener, it's a great teacher. I think it's important that folks have an intention and they utilize that additional energy to focus on a project or a task or something helpful or critical, but it's not going to fix your life, right? You have to fix your life. The sovereignty still lies within you. The choices still lies within you. Psychedelics just make it a little bit easier because of the impact they have on the brain. They help with neuroplasticity, the production of BDNF, right? That helps us to learn quicker and adapt faster. And as we already talked about, they downregulate the fear response from the amygdala, making us more courageous. So we can make difficult choices and decisions that otherwise we would not be able to make. And I think if we just focus on those two aspects and elements, and recognize that even well past the age of 26, we're still capable of changing. And psychedelics, especially microdosing, can often help to facilitate that process to let go of old patterns and behaviors and step into new ones that really support the path that we want to go down.
Paul, this has been a productive conversation for sure. I hope that everyone listening to this not only picks up your book and as some of the other ones you recommended as well. I will say that I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but I can tell you that there's a documentary on Netflix called Have a Good Trip.
Yeah.
That is rather, because I know that there's some people that,
Entertaining.
yeah, I think there's some people that are like, but wait, there are some elements. It's an entertaining documentary too. I don't know that it's
And How to
necessarily,
Change Your Mind is also a docuseries on Netflix now.
yeah,
So the book that Michael Pollan wrote in 2018, it's now a 4-part docuseries
yeah,
on Netflix. So folks could also check out How to Change Your Mind if you want like a more scientific
yeah.
kind of lens on what's going on
Yeah.
as well.
This has been great, Paul. The book is called Mastering Microdosing: How to Use Subperceptual Psychedelics to Heal Trauma, Improve Performance, and Transform Your Life. Where can people pick up the book and where can people keep up with the work that you're doing?
The book is on Amazon, so that's going to be the best way to do it. It was a self-published book. So check out Amazon.com, Mastering Microdosing, and then go to thethirdwave.co, or just type in Third Wave Microdosing or Third Wave Psychedelics. That's our educational platform. We have free guides. I have a podcast myself. So if folks want to go deeper down the rabbit hole with microdosing or all things psychedelic, the Third Wave is the best platform to do that. And then I'm on Instagram and Twitter at Paul Austin 3W. So if folks are listening to this, don't hesitate to reach out. I love hearing from folks. So send me a DM, tweet at me, do whatever you need to. If you have any questions, I'm here to support.
Thanks for having a productive conversation with me today, Paul.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks to Paul for joining me on the program. You can check out the show notes right where you are getting your podcast. It has all the relevant links and everything that you need there. Just wherever you're getting this podcast right now, just take a look and explore. Again, another thing that you can do to support the show, other than obviously check out the show notes and, of course, subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcast, be it YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, is to check out the sponsors that you heard mentioned during our conversation today. You can go to mikevardy.com/podcast sponsors to check out those sponsors. Click on the links. That way they know that we sent you, and it helps keep the show going strong. And by the way, leaving a rating or review for the show wherever you get your podcast is also helpful. Helps me learn what to do better, what's going well, all that fun stuff. I want to make this show better for you each and every week. That's it for this week. Until next time, I'm Mike Vardy, the host of A Productive Conversation, reminding you to stop doing productive and start being productive. See you later.